The air itself was a weapon, dry and abrasive, rasping against the mucous membranes until every breath felt like inhaling powdered glass. It was the third day since the verdict, and the heat in the cell was no longer an external condition. It had become an internal resident, radiating from her bones outward. Ilara knew the intent of the jury, the sneering plantation owner who passed judgment, and the bailiffs who had sealed the heavy, iron-reinforced oak door. They did not want her to have the quick mercy of the rope or the clean final rupture of a bullet. They wanted her suffering to be a prolonged, didactic exhibition, a testament to the power of the white man's justice over the black woman's body. They had sentenced her to die of thirst. Her crime was murder, a crime she hadn't committed. Her true transgression, in their eyes, was daring to exist too close to power, too close to the secrets of the big house. The cell, which they grimly referred to as the pit, was not a standard jailhouse fixture. It was an ancient subterranean storage vault dug deep into the clay soil near the property line of the sprawling, fever-ridden Magnolia Creek plantation. Some miles inland from the great restless river, the walls were thick, sweat-slicked stone, designed to keep root vegetables cool, but now served to trap the equatorial humidity and stifle any stray breeze. The floor was packed earth, cracked and dusty, impossible to excavate with her bare, weakened hands, yet it was the only surface her broken body knew. The silence was punctuated only by the buzzing of gnats, which, maddeningly, sought the dampness of her eyeballs and the edges of her lips, a cruel reminder of the moisture she craved. Her tongue was swollen, thick, and fissured, grating painfully against the roof of her mouth with every involuntary swallow. It had been hours since she produced saliva. Her skin felt brittle, stretched tight over her skeleton, and the tears, those useless relics of earlier despair, had long since dried up in her ducts. Even the sweat refused to flow. Her body, wise in its ancient chemistry, was preserving the last precious reserves of water, prolonging her agony for the amusement of the men who waited above. Ilara raised a hand, heavy as lead, and traced the deep, angry line etched into her wrist by the rope used to bind her during the sham trial. The accusation had been swift, the evidence fabricated with malicious ease. Mistress Helena Thorne lay dead in the parlor, a silver carving knife plunged deep beneath her ribcage. Ilara, the head maid, had been found kneeling beside her, paralyzed not by guilt, but by shock and the terrifying recognition of the real perpetrator slipping away into the shadow of the portico. The weapon, they claimed, was hers, carelessly left among the laundry. The motive, they declared with self-satisfied certainty, was the resentment of servitude. She tried to conjure the taste of water, not the lukewarm slop from the plantation well, but cool, vital spring water, bursting with mineral clarity. She remembered the hidden creek where she used to sneak away to wash the linen, the current swift and clean, bubbling over rounded stones. The memory was excruciating. It was a torture worse than the thirst itself, because it was a reminder of a life still within reach, yet completely severed. How many sunrises had passed? 3, perhaps 4. Time had become viscous, measured not in hours, but in the rapid, shallow beating of her own heart and the increasingly desperate hallucinations. Sometimes the dust on the floor appeared to shimmer, coalescing into a dark, inviting puddle. She would drag herself forward, scraping her knees on the rough clay, only to find the puddle was merely a trick of the light, offering nothing but gritty disappointment and the bitter smell of dry soil. The guards, 2 large doughy men named Jeb and Silas, would occasionally shuffle outside the heavy door, their voices muffled but discernible. They were waiting too. They had placed bets on how long the uppity slave girl would last before her mind broke. 3 days, 4 tops, she heard Silas say yesterday, his voice thick with chewing tobacco. They go fast once the spitting stops. Their insides dry up like old leather. and the knowledge that her death was entertainment, a morbid clock-watching exercise, fueled a terrifying surge of cold fury deep within her failing core. She had to survive, not just for herself, but to prove them wrong, to defy the very gravity of their hate. But fury requires energy, and energy requires water. The loop was unbreakable. She was trapped in a self-consuming cycle of desiccation. The true murderer, the pale, viperous overseer, Mr. Finch, had looked straight into her eyes during the trial. He had stood beside the grieving Master Thorne, his face a mask of false sympathy, knowing Elara would be the perfect, silent scapegoat. She had seen him wipe the blood from his cuff moments after the mistress fell. He knew she knew, and now he was safe, sipping cool lemonade on the veranda while she was dying a slow, agonizing death, every nerve ending screaming for release. It was late in what she guessed was the fourth day. The lack of water was now destroying her motor functions. Her muscles twitched involuntarily, and a persistent, high-pitched ringing had replaced all other sounds in her ears. She was drifting into that terrifying state where reality warps, where the brain, starved of fluid, begins to manufacture its own desperate stories. She began to mumble the names of the dead, names of those who had suffered and perished on the plantation before her. Toby, who tried to run north. Martha, who died in childbirth, neglected by the mistress now avenged. She spoke to them in a dry whisper, asking for a sign, an intervention. "God is not here," a cynical voice deep within her mind replied. "Only the dry earth." She curled into a fetal position, pressing her burning cheek against the cooler clay floor, seeking the slight thermal difference. She was too weak now to move, barely strong enough to maintain consciousness. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the stone above her, sealing her fate, an unjust coffin buried alive beneath the heavy, punishing sun. This is the end. The thought was quiet, calm, resigned. She felt the edges of her vision darkening, the ringing in her ears escalating into a shriek. She was approaching the final precipice of desiccation, the point where the body simply shuts down, conserving nothing, yielding everything. Then, a sound. It was not the sound of Silas or Jeb shuffling above. It was not the buzz of the gnats or the internal scream of her own dying body. It was a low, deep, geological rumble. It vibrated through the packed earth beneath her cheek, a sensation utterly alien to the arid quiet of the pit. It was less like thunder and more like a great submerged beast stretching its colossal limbs far beneath the crust of the earth. Elara forced one eye open, the dim, dust-filled light filtering through the small, barred vent near the ceiling showed nothing unusual, just the oppressive stone and the desperate darkness. But the vibration persisted, stronger now, a resonant thrum that seemed to shake the very foundations of the old vault. It was a sound intimately tied to the land, an echoing report that spoke of immense, unstoppable forces far beyond human control. Fear, fresh and terrifying, momentarily eclipsed the agony of the thirst. Was this an earthquake? A judgment? The pit was old, but it was sturdy. Yet this sound, it carried the unmistakable weight of liquid mass, of water in tremendous, violent motion. She remembered the local lore, the whispers among the field hands about the unpredictable nature of the great river, the muddy artery that snaked through the entire region, miles away from the plantation house. They called it the Great Eater, the one that swallowed land whole, chewing through banks and altering its course without warning, especially during the vicious summer storms that sometimes lashed the coastline. The Thorne plantation had always been considered safe, built on high ground, well above the traditional floodplain. But the river was known for its malice, its sudden geological whims. It didn't just flood its banks. Sometimes it decided it preferred an entirely new path, carving hundreds of yards of fresh channel overnight. The vibrations intensified, accompanied now by a new, horrifying element, a pervasive mineral odor that assaulted her starved nostrils. It was the smell of cold, moving water, rich silt, and centuries of decaying river debris, a scent utterly out of place in her dry tomb. She dragged herself toward the nearest wall, the stone she had been leaning against for days. She pressed her ear to the cold surface, the roaring growing louder, now discernible as a chorus of shifting stones and rushing water. It was not gentle. It sounded like an explosion of liquid dynamite, the deep, powerful churning of a volume of water so vast it could relocate mountains. Her eyes, dry and aching, scanned the thick stone structure. She saw it then, a hairline fracture running vertically down the seam where two massive stones met, a crack she hadn't noticed before, camouflaged by dust and shadow. And from that fracture, a single dark bead of moisture appeared. It was impossibly black in the dim light, thick with clay and suspended river muck, but it was unambiguously wet. It moved slowly, defying gravity for a split second, before sliding down the stone face. Ilara watched, mesmerized, as the trickle began. One drop followed another, rapidly coalescing into a dark, muddy streak, dripping onto the dusty floor of the pit. It was water. A flood of it, perhaps, but still water. The agonizing dryness that had been her intended executioner was suddenly, violently challenged. The river, the indifferent giant of nature, had decided to intervene, ripping through the earth and redirecting its destructive path towards the very vault designed to ensure her death by thirst. The irony was a bitter, desperate taste, replacing the metallic tang of dehydration. The sentence was death, but the means were changing. They wanted her to perish by lack of water. Now she might drown in a torrent of it. The crack widened with a grinding noise, and a stream, not a trickle, erupted, hitting the clay floor with a forceful splat. The sound was both horrifying and miraculously beautiful to her starved ears. It brought the promise of quenching the fire in her throat, even as it delivered the immediate threat of a swift, dark burial. Ilara pushed herself back against the opposite wall, watching the muddy pool spread, soaking the dust, swallowing the dryness. Her chance had arrived, a terrifying, improbable escape hatched by the raw, merciless power of nature, not by the kindness of man. The water was rising fast, bubbling up through the floor cracks, filling the pit with the smell of freedom and death. Now she faced a choice that was no choice at all: succumb to the slow, agonizing end mandated by the white man's justice, or fight the swift, cold execution brought by the river's rage. If she were to survive, she would have to drink this murky, silt-choked water, trusting that the toxins and the rot would not kill her faster than the thirst already was. Then she would have to find a way out of this rapidly filling stone box before the pressure of the river's redirected force crushed the entire structure into a watery grave. The floor was slick with mud now. The roar outside was deafening, the sound of millions of gallons of water demanding entry. This was not salvation. This was merely a trade, a switch from the horror of desiccation to the horror of submersion. But for a woman sentenced to die, a new horror meant a new chance. The first instinct of survival, primal and overriding, seized her, the desperate urge to drink, to live long enough to face the next step, the escape. The river had changed course for her. Now she had to follow its terrifying lead. Stay tuned for part 2, where Ilara must confront the rising waters and exploit the impossible weakness of her flooded prison cell. The water, initially a blessed, vile kiss that momentarily silenced the scorching shriek of her throat, swiftly transformed into the most immediate, aggressive enemy. It did not merely rise, it surged, a muddy, roaring behemoth tearing through the brittle stillness of the subterranean world where she had been abandoned to dry dust. The shift in dread was absolute, trading the slow, agonizing internal consumption of dehydration for the cold, crushing external assault of hydrostatic pressure. Her body, already a ravaged landscape of weakness and despair, was now forced into a desperate, unending ballet of treading water, a futile struggle against the weight of the iron shackles clamped to her ankles. These heavy circlets, meant only to prevent terrestrial escape, now served as anchors specifically designed for rapid, humiliating submersion. Each movement was an agonizing negotiation between the need to keep her head above the foul, black surface and the unbearable drag of the oxidized metal. The cell was a tomb repurposed as an immersion tank. In the suffocating darkness, the sounds were amplified to a terrifying degree. The churning slosh of the water against the rough-hewn stone walls, the faint, sickening clunk of debris, river detritus, earth, and perhaps the splintered remnants of poor, trapped creatures battering the inner surfaces. But the most terrifying sound was her own ragged breathing, the shallow gasps swallowed almost instantly by the cold liquid that promised to fill her lungs next. She had been condemned by Judge Harrison, a man whose jowls shook with self-righteous fury as he declared her guilt in the sudden, bloody demise of Master Silas. Her sentence, to be left in the darkest, driest corner of the plantation's abandoned root cellar, sealed off from sun and rain until she withered to nothing, was intended as a theatrical, symbolic death. A lesson etched in slow, visible suffering for every other enslaved soul who might harbor thoughts of resistance or, worse, freedom. Now the very earth seemed to reject this judgment, substituting a swift, chaotic obliteration for the meticulously planned, silent torture. In the throes of fighting for air, the images of the accusation were brutally clear, intensified by the panic. She remembered the shock, not of finding Master Silas dead, but of the instant certainty that she would be blamed. She had been the only one near the smokehouse at the time, retrieving cured meats. The knife, still slick with blood, had been tossed near her feet. It was a perfect, calculated frame. Silas had been a brutal man, cruel and unpredictable, but also immensely wealthy and critically white. His death demanded an immediate, visible sacrifice, and she, with her known stubbornness and sharp eyes, was the most convenient target. A life of chattel was deemed cheap enough to pay for the illusion of order. The water was rising faster now, pressing her against the low, arched ceiling of the cell. She had to tilt her head back sharply, straining her neck to keep her nose clear of the slurry. The cold seeped into her bones, an absolute chill that promised death not through fever or infection, but through simple cessation, hypothermia, drowning, or exhaustion. The river offered her a grim menu of terminal options, each preferable, in that moment, only to the thirst that had preceded it. She fought the urge to close her eyes, knowing that darkness outside the water was manageable, but darkness under the water was final. She scanned the tiny space, trying to discern the source of the persistent, terrible current. It was not mere seepage anymore. It was an ingress, violent and focused. The entire river, the massive, muddy spine of the territory, seemed to have twisted its attention directly toward this single, forgotten hole in the ground. Why? The question burned hotter than the thirst ever had. Was it simply a catastrophic rain event, a fluke of nature coinciding precisely with her final hours? Or was there a deeper, more unsettling significance to this geological rebellion? The local folklore, whispered among the enslaved community, was full of tales of the river's vengeance, old spirits disturbed, ancient promises broken, leading the waters to devour the very land that contained them. She remembered an old woman, Mama Lyra, who spoke of the river as a living, seeing entity, older than the colonizers, older than the trees. Lyra had said that the river judged the land it touched, and when the injustice became too heavy, when the blood spilled into the ground became too concentrated, the river would rise up to wash the slate clean. The thought, bizarre and desperate, offered a terrifying flicker of hope. If the river was judging, perhaps it judged her, innocent. But the river was not a savior, it was a force. a blind, impartial force that, even if it invalidated the judgment of the oppressors, offered only a different form of execution. To be saved from dying of thirst, only to perish by drowning, felt like a cosmic mockery, a final cruel joke played upon her struggle for life. The water level hit a critical point, forcing her to abandon treading. There was no space left. She had to press her back against the rough ceiling, using the arch of the stone to leverage a desperate inch of breathing room. The rusty iron of the cell door, now submerged beneath her feet, provided no foothold. It was slick, cold, and promised only a swift slide into oblivion. Her mind returned relentlessly to the identity of the true killer. It was the crucial open loop that she might never close. Master Silas had many enemies. His own son, perhaps, who coveted the plantation. A rival landowner, or maybe one of the overseers, whom Silas treated with only slightly more contempt than he treated the enslaved people. The system, however, did not care about truth. It cared only about consequence and control. She replayed the brief, horrifying trial in her mind. A mockery held in the master's drawing room, smelling of cheap tobacco and fear. She was not allowed to speak, not truly. Every attempt to defend herself was met with laughter or a sharp cuff from the constable. The evidence was the knife, her proximity, and the color of her skin. Case closed. The sentence was delivered with a dramatic pause, the severity of the slow death designed to maximize impact. They wanted her to suffer, to regret, to apologize silently to the cold stones for daring to exist. But the river had interrupted the performance. The pressure inside the cell was intense. The very air felt thick and heavy, saturated with the earthy, mineral odor of deep water. Her skin had pruned beyond recognition. She was shivering uncontrollably, the tremors running deep into her core, making the simple act of holding her body against the ceiling exhausting. The chains cut into her ankles, rubbing the already chafed skin raw. A sudden, sharp pattern interrupt ripped her from the introspective misery, a grating sound louder and deeper than anything before. It sounded like the foundation of the world was shifting. A small piece of the ceiling, where the mortar was weakest, gave way, showering her face with grit and mud. A rush of cold air followed, brief but miraculous, suggesting a larger structural collapse happening above her or outside the cell. This realization offered the first concrete possibility of escape, however remote. If the structure was failing, the prison was failing. The death sentence was being undermined not by justice, but by geological chaos. She needed to exploit that chaos. The sound of rushing water intensified, indicating that the river was actively carving a new pathway, possibly eroding the bank upon which the entire root cellar complex was built. The flood was no longer a contained event within the cell walls. It was an environmental catastrophe unfolding around her. She pushed against the ceiling with her shoulders, ignoring the scraping pain. She sought any weakness, any fissure that might be wide enough to afford a handhold, or perhaps a space to wedge her head. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, dragged across the slimy stone. The shackles were her undoing. They forced her legs down, making any sustained lift of her body impossible. If she released the pressure on the ceiling, she would sink instantly. She had to maintain the precarious balance, pressing up while desperately searching outward. In a horrifying escalation, the light, or what passed for it, a faint muddy gray filtering through the water from some unknown source, began to flicker. Something large was moving outside the cell door, shifting in the currents. It could be a tree trunk, a collapsed section of wall, or something else, something terrifying and unknown, dragged along by the river's merciless pull. The fear of drowning now merged with the primal horror of being crushed. If the river was dragging massive debris past the cell entrance, the remaining structure was unlikely to hold. She was trapped in a crumbling cavity, waiting for the ceiling to become the floor. A memory flashed. The blacksmith who had secured the shackles, a large, taciturn man named Gideon. He had looked at her with pity, a dangerous emotion in that context. As he hammered the rivets, he had mumbled something about the metal, something about the age of the iron, and the possibility of weakness near the hinge point under extreme duress. Extreme duress. She was beyond that. She needed to exploit that forgotten vulnerability. She pressed her back harder against the ceiling, allowing her legs to dangle, feeling the increasing force of the water's current pulling them sideways. She focused all her remaining strength onto the chain, connecting the two ankle cuffs. It was a thick link, but perhaps, if she could find a leverage point, if she could turn the drowning water into a tool. The river offered no respite. It was cold, relentless, and smelled overwhelmingly of old earth and fresh catastrophe. It was demanding a life, either through the prescribed slow torture or through its own violent, impersonal cleansing. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the water, that the moment she gave up the fight against the chains, the moment she surrendered to the cold, she would be gone, swallowed without a trace. The plantation owners would find an empty, flooded cell, and they would assume she drowned, her body swept away, achieving the same result as the thirst, but with the added complication of a massive, unexplained structural failure that would undoubtedly draw unwelcome attention to their methods. The survival instinct, hammered thin by days of fear and starvation, suddenly ignited with a fierce, cold brilliance. She was not fighting just for breath. She was fighting to expose the injustice. To die here, unseen, was to validate their lie. She began to test the chain links, using the jagged edge of a protruding stone from the ceiling as a rough, inadequate file. The friction was minimal, the effort immense, and the sound of her scraping was barely audible over the roar of the water outside. The cold made her fingers clumsy, unresponsive. This was not a quick fix. It was a desperate Sisyphean labor performed underwater against the clock of the rising, surging river. The water had reached its zenith, pressing her completely flat against the stone ceiling. There was perhaps 3 inches of airspace remaining, barely enough to accommodate the curve of her skull. Her ears were submerged, transforming the outside world into a garbled, deafening static. The only way forward was to descend momentarily, risk the gulp of foul water, and apply pressure where the chain met the iron cuff. She took a deep, shuddering breath, a lungful of the thin, stale air left in the pocket. It tasted of dirt and imminent death. She submerged her head completely. The blackness was instantaneous and total. Her hands found the connecting link, slippery with rust and river slime. She braced her foot against the submerged doorframe, a momentary slippery hold, and pulled, focusing all the pent-up tension of her survival on that single resisting piece of metal. It did not break. It did not budge. But in that moment, in the suffocating blackness, she felt a subtle change in the current, a shift in the water pressure that indicated the external situation was growing far worse or far more opportunistic. The river was rearranging its world, and perhaps, just perhaps, it was opening a crack in hers. She needed more light, more air, and above all, freedom from the iron anchors that bound her to this watery grave. Her struggle continued, unseen and unheard, a silent, furious battle against fate, man, and the relentless, cold judgment of the river. The water, frigid and thick with the heavy sediment of the Mississippi Delta, became not merely a liberator, but a relentless, demanding master. It pressed against Ilara's lungs, a crushing, palpable weight that argued savagely against the fragile instinct to breathe. The relief of moisture had long since vanished, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of asphyxiation. The darkness was absolute, a viscous, ink-black curtain permeated only by the shifting, ghastly effervescence of trapped air bubbles rising from the decaying floorboards far below. She was suspended in the churning epicenter of the Earth's judgment. The cell, designed specifically to contain the complete absence of life-giving liquid, was now a roaring subterranean cistern, amplifying every terrifying acoustic of the flood. The sounds were monstrous, the grinding of stone against stone, the groan of ancient wooden beams snapping under hydraulic pressure, and the ceaseless, hungry rush of the river, carving new paths through the very foundation of the plantation above. Ilara's mind, sharpened by the near-death clarity of her thirst and now reeling from the immediate threat of drowning, registered the one crucial, impossible detail: the ceiling hatch, the metal grate bolted shut by the overseer's callous command, had been forced upward not by human hands, but by the relentless geological insistence of the river's rage. It was jammed open against a section of the collapsed masonry, creating a jagged, precarious aperture into the unknown tunnels above. Tunnels she knew were never meant to be seen or traversed. She pushed upward, her head scraping against the jagged edges of broken brick and mortar. The current was a beast, attempting to pin her back down into the depths, urging her to succumb to the heavy pull of the silt-laden water. Every muscle screamed, her malnourished body struggling against the sheer volume and force of the invading flow. She didn't swim. She clawed, she scrabbled, she forced her way through the narrow breach, propelled by a raw, feral desperation that eclipsed all logic. The path immediately constricted. She had traded the singular pit of her imprisonment for a labyrinthine network of submerged drainage channels and old abandoned cisterns, the subterranean arteries of the sprawling, rotting estate above. These were the veins of the plantation's dark heart, rarely accessed and long forgotten, now violently flushed by nature's sudden, devastating surge. The true horror of her escape began here, in the murky, echoing silence of the flooded undercroft. The water was speaking, or perhaps her mind, deprived of oxygen, was inventing the chilling narrative. It tasted of iron and rot, but also of history, a cold, metallic bitterness that seeped into her pores. As she blindly navigated a sharp bend in the channel, her outstretched hand brushed against something unnervingly soft, yet dense. She recoiled instantly, adrenaline spiking, but the current dragged her back. Instinct, the cold, brutal imperative of survival, demanded she investigate. She brought her face close, utilizing the faint, almost psychic glow that sometimes pierces absolute darkness when the eyes adjust, but saw only distorted shapes. She reached again, sweeping her hands through the dense flow, and felt fabric, thick and coarse, tangled around a weight that felt suspiciously like a shin bone. This water was not just the river, it was an exhumation. Ilara realized with nauseating certainty that this network of tunnels had served more than just drainage for the plantation's frequent storms. They were conduits for disposal. The shifting silt and the collapsing earth were releasing secrets entombed decades, perhaps a century, before she was even born. She was swimming through a mass grave, the water itself heavy with the particulate remains of countless others who had suffered and perished within the silent walls of this land. The pressure was immense, not just hydrological but spiritual. The water carried the cold, silent sorrow of the unavenged. She swam onward, using her feet to push off solid, submerged stone walls, constantly fighting the disorientation of the heavy current that threatened to turn her around and send her spiraling back into the deepest recesses of the flooded structure. The pattern interrupts were frequent and jarring. A sudden, terrifying shift in the current as another section of the foundation gave way above. The sharp, agonizing burn of the cold water in her throat when she involuntarily gasped for air. The recurring dread of collision with the unseen, sunken remains of past victims. The thought of the overseer, of the master and mistress who had condemned her, fueled a grim reservoir of strength. They had sentenced her to die of a dry, agonizing emptiness. Now she was surrounded by an overwhelming abundance of the very element intended to be denied. This inversion was not coincidence. It was divine, cruel irony, manifested through a geological cataclysm. She found a sudden, blessed pocket of air, a space no larger than a coffin, created where a segment of the tunnel ceiling had failed to fully submerge. She clung to the rough-hewn stone, gasping, coughing up mouthfuls of muddy water and struggling to pull the life-giving oxygen deep into her starved lungs. In the partial silence of this narrow refuge, she heard it, not the roar of the water, but a chilling sound that seemed to originate from the stone itself. A low, resonant grinding, like gears turning impossibly slowly. It was the foundation of the house, of the great house where she was accused of murder, grinding itself into dust. This realization re-engaged her focus. The river had not merely flooded the dungeon, it was actively destroying the structure built upon the injustice that had nearly claimed her life. She was not just escaping, she was a witness to the final, violent reckoning of the place. A sudden, powerful tremor rocked the entire cavity. The air pocket diminished instantly, the water level rising nearly a foot. She knew she had mere seconds. Survival was now contingent upon finding the egress point before the entire subterranean system collapsed and sealed her inside forever. Driven by the renewed terror, she dove back into the deluge. The way forward was blocked by a wall of debris, massive, waterlogged timbers and chunks of brick. But through a narrow aperture near the theoretical surface, she saw a faint, milky grey light. Not daylight, but the diffused, sickly illumination of the water mixing with the sky, a sign that the tunnel led outside, or at least to a large, open body of water. She slammed her shoulder repeatedly into the debris, ignoring the excruciating pain. The wood was heavy, saturated, refusing to budge. The pressure mounted behind her, forcing her forward, threatening to crush her against the barricade. She was trapped again, but this time the confinement was temporary, mutable. With a final, desperate surge of manic energy, fueled by the image of the overseer's sneering face, she located a loose timber and shoved it with all her might. The structure gave way, not in a clean break, but in a horrific, slow-motion cascade. As the debris shifted, something else floated into her path. It was not bone, nor fabric, nor the general detritus of the river. It was a familiar, distinctive length of rope, the very rope used to fasten the trunk that contained the master's hidden silver, the trunk that she was accused of having looted and then using to justify the fatal blow to the mistress's head. The revelation was instantaneous, shocking, and profoundly clarifying, even in the depths of the drowning tunnel. She had been accused of murder by bludgeoning, the motive being theft. But the rope she saw, caught momentarily in the shifting current before being swept away, was attached to a larger, heavier shape, now becoming visible in the turbulent gloom. A body. The actual body of the mistress, heavy and lifeless, had been wrapped, weighted, and dumped into this very system long before Ilara was arrested. She hadn't been killed upstairs and left for dead. She had been murdered, discreetly disposed of through these ancient tunnels, and then Ilara, the convenient scapegoat, was blamed for a crime that was already a cold, wet secret buried beneath the house. The killer was still above, perhaps watching the destruction, or perhaps already fleeing. But the river, in its blind geological justice, had uncovered the truth, bringing the evidence, the victim herself, directly to the falsely accused in the deepest, darkest hour of her struggle. This was the climax. The river was the executioner of lies, the ultimate revealer. Ilara pushed past the awful, floating tableau of the victim, a silent confirmation of her innocence, and surged into the open. The tunnel spat her out, violently, into the churning, muddy waters of the swollen tributary. She gasped, fighting the instinct to immediately suck in air, careful to time her breaths between the high, choppy waves of the flood. Above her, the sky was a bruised, terrifying grey, illuminated by occasional flashes of distant lightning. She was free. Free of the pit, free of the chains, free of the oppressive heat, and free of the false accusation. But the horror was far from over. She looked back at the muddy embankment from which she had emerged. The ground above the plantation house was destabilizing at an alarming rate. The massive flooding of the underground network had turned the earth into a heavy, saturated sponge, unable to bear the weight of the structure built upon centuries of blood and deceit. The great house, the symbol of her enslavement and near execution, did not so much fall as slowly, majestically subside. It began with a deep, sickening groan, a noise that shook the air and seemed to defy the limits of sound. The front portico leaned sharply, cracks spreading through the plaster like lightning bolts frozen in time. Then, the entire structure began to tilt, slowly at first, then rapidly, sliding into the expanding sinkhole created by the relentless river. Wood splintered, bricks crumbled, and the heavy roof collapsed inward with a final crushing roar. The air was filled with a massive, noxious cloud of dust, mud, and the pulverized history of the plantation. When the sound subsided, there was only the gurgling, hungry noise of the river consuming the remains. Justice had been delivered not by the courts of men, but by the overwhelming geological power of nature correcting a historical imbalance. Ilara drifted downstream, carried by the current. She did not look back. The cold water, once her prison and her death sentence, was now her carriage of emancipation. She was numb, utterly exhausted, yet buoyed by an almost manic clarity. She was the survivor, the anomaly, the one whom the river had elected to save, to reveal its buried truths to. The river finally deposited her upon a muddy, forested bank several miles downstream, far from the ruins. She crawled out of the water, every movement a profound act of will, her body shaking violently from the exposure and the exertion. She lay there, half submerged in the cold, wet soil, tasting mud, rot, and the strange metallic tang of freedom. She had been sentenced to die of thirst, and saved by a catastrophic flood that delivered the evidence of her innocence and destroyed her oppressors. The irony was a heavy cloak she would wear for the rest of her days. She survived, not because of intervention from man, nor by her own design, but by the chaotic, cleansing violence of the earth. As the morning light, pale and weak, finally broke through the storm clouds, Ilara slowly pushed herself to her feet. She was naked beneath a thick crust of mud and silt, stripped of everything but her life and the terrifying knowledge she now carried in her soul, the knowledge of the dead still swimming beneath the ruins. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to walk away from the river that had both sentenced and saved her. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with the constant peril of a world that still sought to claim her, but she carried the weight of the river's truth, a terrifying, silent witness to the end of a corrupt regime. The river had paid her sentence. Now her life was her own to claim, forged in the terror of the deep. Conclusion, payoff. Ilara vanished into the dark woods that bordered the river, a phantom silhouette against the grey dawn. She left behind no tracks in the saturated earth, only the faint metallic scent of the floodwater. The plantation was a sinkhole filled with churning water and pulverized lies. The men who sentenced her were gone, consumed by the same force that liberated her. Her escape was more than physical. It was a transition into a terrifying, solitary freedom, forever haunted by the cold, deep silence of the dead she had swum among. She was the ghost of the water, a survivor carrying the secret history of the soil. CTA. Reflect on the power of the natural world to deliver the justice denied by man. Consider the secrets still buried beneath the foundations of the land, waiting for the next flood to expose them. Do you think the river's justice was complete, or is vengeance a current that never truly ceases to flow?